welcome everybody to the promotion breakout session on legal, regulatory and economic aspects. I hope you've enjoyed the videos this week, and looking at today's agenda, we will do a warm-up and a short introduction of the involved project members. Then I will summarize the key messages of legal, regulatory and economic aspects before we come to the Q&A, which is embedded in 2 surveys where we are interested in your questions. My name is Mark Schmidt. I work for TenneT since 2009, and I'm heading the Department of Regulation Germany within the Regulatory Affairs unit. Within promotion, I lead the work package 7 on regulation and financing.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alexandra Armeni from Deutsche Windguard, project engineer in energy markets and politics, involved in working package 7, regulation and financing. And our project role is the task leader of the financing framework for MSD Offshore Grid.
Cecile from the University in Groningen does her PhD research in legal topics and is within promotion task leader for the legal framework. Today, unfortunately, she cannot be present due to her parental leave. Hannah?
Here at the energy system team. Hi, sorry, I think I might have been muted just then. Hi, my name is Hannah Evans. I'm a manager in the energy systems team at the Carbon Trust. The Carbon Trust have been involved in Work Package 7 and Work Package 12 of the promotion project, supporting the task leaders throughout the duration of the project and working across the legal, economic and finance aspects.
Hi, good afternoon. Jelle van Uden. I work for TenneT. I work as an advisor for promotion and currently also for the North Sea Wind Power Hub. I was a member of Work Package 12, closely working together with members of Work Package 7 to bring in the non-technical recommendations into the deployment plan of Work Package 12.
My name is Lawrence de Vries. I work at Delft University of Technology, and I've been working on questions regarding electricity market design and regulation for many years. And here at Work Package 12, I worked on the design of offshore markets. So the question, how do you price the wind that's being generated offshore?
Hello, I'm Pradyumna Bhagwat. I work for the Florence School of Regulation. The Florence School of Regulation was task lead for the economic framework in Work Package 7.
And hello, everyone. My name is Carlo Degli Esposti. I'm managing partner together with Graham Steele and Pierre Bornard of Bornard Steele Degli Esposti Associates. I've been working together with Work Package 7 in order to help the experts finding potential and then summarize the contents they've been developing into the final deliverable for summarizing the 3.
Thank you, Carlo.
Hi, my name is Antino Schneider. I work at TenneT in the Department of Regulatory Affairs, and I have been a member of Work Package 7 since the end of last year.
My name is Kilian Seitz. I'm an advisor for regulatory affairs, specialized in development of offshore grids. And I worked for TenneT for more than 5 years and was in charge of Work Package 7. That's it.
Hello, I'm John Moore. I work for TenneT as an advisor in strategy and partnerships, and I've been leading Work Package 12 and on the deployment plan.
Yeah, thanks everybody for the introduction. In addition, we have Jochen here, Jochen from Stiftung Offshore Wind, and he's supporting us with the event in all technical matters. Let's come to some more details of what we want to do in the breakout session. In the next 20 minutes, I will summarize the key messages of this week's videos. During that time, please file your questions in the chat function stating your name, the organization, and the question you have. We will summarize those questions and come back to the questions in the Q&A session. Before we start that, the Q&A session, we prepared a survey to get a better feeling on which topics you are most interested. Let me start with some facts about the Promotion project. Promotion is the biggest project funded by DG Energy ever, with a budget about 42 million euro and a project duration of 4.5 years. We have 34 partners from 11 countries working for the project Promotion. Among them, we have 6 TSOs, 7 manufacturers, 10 universities, 4 research institutes, 1 test lab, 4 consultancy companies, and 2 developers. Promotion overall has 16 work packages, most of them on technical issues, but today we will focus on work package 7, regulation and financing, and work package 12 with the deployment plan, which brings everything together. What you've seen in the videos and what you will see in this breakout session today is just a small summary of the work which has been performed in both packages. You can see here that work package 7 focused on the legal, economic, and financial framework for a meshed offshore grid. The deliverable D7.9 was then the key deliverable entering into the deployment plan. Work package 12 issued 4 deliverables, concluding in deliverable D12.4, the final deployment plan. Content-wise, I will summarize the videos which were launched this week. So I will focus on 6 topics. First is the legal aspects and the question, how do we cooperate? Second is the topic of hybrid assets or small bidding zones. Third is the question, how much does a meshed offshore grid cost? Fourth topic deals with the question of how to attract investments in a meshed offshore grid and how this can be financed. The fifth is the cross-border cost allocation. And last, but very interesting, is the recommendation on the timing for an efficient rollout of the grid. We are confronted with a lot of legal questions on how do we cooperate. In more specific, we looked at a lot of questions. For example, on what topics should the coastal states or European Union states cooperate? On which law is that based? Do we need additional agreements? And if so, which type of agreements should that be? In terms of timing, when do we need such an agreement? And why is a long-term stability so important for a meshed grid development? In general terms, one could say, do we really need a legal framework which is common for everybody or every member state or every coastal state? And the answer could be no. No, because the coastal states can solve the problems as they come along. Or no, because we can focus on the short-term projects first. On the other hand, the answer could be yes. Yes, because the earlier a legal framework is created, the more benefits will be there. And yes, because for investors, a stable legal framework is key. In case there is no legal framework, it will hold back investors as they cannot trust the legal framework. And yes, because also experience from the past shows that it makes sense and takes time to develop a legal framework. So our conclusion is, yes, we need a legal framework. It's very important that the states around the North Sea all have a similar idea why we are building a meshed offshore grid and on which values and principles it should be based. If the states differ about their opinion, this will lead to trouble when it comes to the construction of the project. So our recommendation is that the legal basis of cooperation should be a North Sea agreement. The governance structure could be, for example, a high-level conference, which takes place annually about big decisions. Some decisions are not so big, but very important, and others very technical or economically. And the idea is to create a committee structure to treat these technical, economical, and spatial planning issues. When political questions arise, they can be solved in a high-level conference. On the organization of decision-making, one question is, for example, do you need a qualified majority or a simple majority to make decisions about a topic? This type of issues needs to be addressed in the agreement in order to make sure the states agree on a topic beforehand. Also, the coordinated grid planning need to be addressed in the contract. On regulatory supervision, obviously the grid will be a natural monopoly. No real competition between the grid owners is there and makes no sense. The question is how this regulatory supervision can be created for an offshore grid. The best way, according to our opinion, is to make sure that we will have a cooperation of the national regulatory authorities. Last point I want to mention here is the conflict resolution. If the parties and grid owners get into conflict, it is important to know how this could be solved. Almost every agreement has a part that says how conflict should be solved. The second big topic deals with the question if we should go for a regulatory solution with a hybrid asset regulation or a market-based approach on small bidding zones. As you can see on this slide, the connection of offshore wind farms is changing, and this is why we need to answer the question. The status quo on the left-hand side shows radial connections on the top and hub connections on the bottom, both connected to one country, here connected to country A. What we see as a future development is a hub-to-hub or even a meshed situation where you don't have a link only with one country A, but also with another country B or even a country C. And the current legal framework is not ready for this kind of questions and connections. Interconnector rules are applicable, so in future, 70% of the capacity should be available to the market. Efficient dispatch could require trade from high to low price zones. This would require subsidizing these transactions or curtailing wind without a physical need to do so. Or TSOs could make the line capacity much higher in order to still comply with the 70% rule and evacuate the wind. Or TSOs decide not to construct the extra link, even though there is a societal benefit on that. And the question is how to solve that. Within promotion, we have developed two solutions. The first one is hybrid asset regulation, where we introduce a new category in the electricity regulation. And the second one is to introduce small bidding zones, which divides the wind grid into different price zones that are defined by network congestions. Both solutions have advantages and disadvantages, or strengths and challenges, how we call it here. Just to mention some. A big advantage of the hybrid asset regulation is that we do not need big changes towards national support schemes and interconnector rules. It is a relatively simple solution and comparable with the current model. On the other hand, small bidding zones leads to economically efficient investments and dispatch. And there is no need for an extra definition in the electricity regulation, which has just changed last year. Possibly, this leads also to lower financial support for the wind parks. And now the interesting question is, on what do we conclude? We highly recommend from the project to push for both solutions, as both will take time to be implemented. We should introduce a new category of hybrid assets in the electricity regulation and further define that. And offshore price zones can be a solution which creates optimal incentives for efficient dispatch. In this solution, there is no need for counter trading. We have an optimal use of cross-border network capacity, and also in the presence of future hydrogen storage or other types of consumption offshore, this will work. With a market-based solution, there's an optimal incentive for curtailment without the need to compensate the owners, because they would choose the degree of overplanting to their parks. The third topic is also interesting, and it's the answer on the question, how much does it cost? The answer to that question is, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on the concept you connect the wind farms. In the 4 illustrations we have shown here, it's always the same. It's country A, it's country B, and it's country C, and all coastal countries with wind productions at the same location. But it differs on the ways how the grid connection is. In the first upper left, we have the business as usual concept, which consists of radial point-to-point connections from wind to shore. The second, to the left below, is the national meshed concept, where constraints on point-to-point are relaxed, but wind farms may only be connected to the country in whose economic zone the wind farm is located. The third is the European meshed grid concept. Here the constraints are further relaxed to allow connection to the closest onshore landing point. And the last but not least is the fourth. It's an island or hub concept with much larger hubs which evacuate power to shore. The cost estimation is based on a methodology which is divided into 3 steps. In the first steps, the different topologies are taken as basis of cost estimation together with the cost data. The second step breaks down the topologies into the main components, and a study is performed on the appropriate design of the topologies. The last step is then, it looks quite simple, combining the first and the second step of the methodology and do the actual cost run. And now it's interesting what comes out of the calculation. You see in that table the CAPEX and OPEX, and it's splitted or divided into 5 years period, where the cumulative CAPEX and OPEX are shown. So we have the period until 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045, and 2050. So at the end, to the right, it is all summarized and summed up. You can see that the hub concept has the overall lowest CAPEX, amounting to around 170 billion by 2050, given an installed capacity of 200 gigawatt. That leads us to the fourth big topic and the question how to attract investors and how to finance that. First of all, we see a higher need of national wind and grid planning. If this is done, the investment needs become transparent, and this provides clarity for investors on the pipeline of projects and estimated investment volumes. That is highly connected to a mixed partial agreement between the countries, because this will lead to higher coordination and binding commitments. Very important for investors is the regulatory framework, because that determines the investor's income. Currently, we have this certainty on national levels, but not for a meshed offshore grid. That is why it is important to have a long-term, stable, and predictable regulatory framework. This brings clarity to investors about regulatory income and their cost recovery. Elements like having no time lag in cost recognition and a clear cost allocation and allocation of liabilities are key to determine the investor's risk profile. Within promotion, different financing structures and options for ownership models were evaluated. We looked at the obvious one, to have TSO structures and cooperation of the involved TSOs. Secondly, we looked at tenders of transmission assets to third parties, the British model. And the third option is even to have one builder for a meshed offshore grid. As already mentioned, remuneration of investments is key. In the short term, financial support by the European Union is highly recommended to eliminate risks for investors and to bridge the financial gaps. In the long term, a regulatory remuneration with a stable regulatory framework should create the right incentive to invest. As a summary, what do we conclude on financing? First of all, the legal and regulatory framework needs to be in place, and it needs to be adequate. Otherwise, we will not have success in developing a financial framework, and nobody will invest. Collaboration, coordination, and most importantly, also a political commitment is needed. And then as third point, the European Union should support in financial terms, but also in terms of coordination and in making the transition from national policies to a common vision for the European North Sea. Financing is an interesting topic, However, as fifth topic, we see that the cross-border cost allocation is important to share the costs among the involved parties. A lot of work has been produced by the project, but also by Acer and NSUE. And in the meantime, this topic has developed so that we can quickly jump to those recommendations we put here. First thing is, we recommend that the CBCA should be formalized as binding contract between the involved parties, following current methodologies. We further think that a common CBCA of the involved parties for a group of projects could be a key enabler for their development. But the parties should be aware that this is definitely a significant threshold to reach such a complete CBCA. The reason is rather simple. A meshed offshore grid has a lot of uncertainties and assumptions at the beginning of such a project. That is why a CBCA will also be with uncertainties. As mentioned in the introduction, Work Package 12 brings everything together, technical, regulatory, and financial aspects, and develops a recommendation for the deployment of a meshed offshore grid. We thought this is an interesting aspect at the end of our breakout session to show you how we see the timing and the rollout of an offshore grid. We divided the development into 5-year steps, the same as you saw on the cost side. And we have different concepts, the same you already know, for example, the hub concept. We prepared 3 slides to show you this development. The first slide is this slide, showing the snapshot of the year 2025 and 2030. The second goes then for the years 2035 and 2040, as well as for the third slide, 2045 and 2050. To understand the 6 small illustrations, I will explain at once. In the 3 above, we showed the development of Connections 2025 with the 3 concepts, the national concept, the hub concept, and the European concept. And below the snapshot of the year 2030, again with those developments. Within the next 10 years, we see the following developments. There will be a standardization. We expect this to be at 525 kV level of the power lines and 2 gigawatt connection capacity. In addition, we will see hybrid assets and hopefully also the first artificial islands with the hub concept. Stakeholder actions are key during this period because it's a starting period. We need a regulation on smaller bidding zones and hybrid assets, as well as an off-sea agreement. The period between 2030 and 2040 is seen as the acceleration period in the wind development. Again, you see in the illustrations above 2035 with the 3 concepts and the year 2040 with the 3 concepts below. In this period, we need to scale up, expand artificial islands, and the meshing is an important topic. On the stakeholder action side, with more meshing, we will need solutions for national support schemes. I guess you're familiar with the illustrations now. So the acceleration period is followed by the stabilization period, which is shown here between the years 2040 and 2050, which is marked by further expansion of meshing and increased connection capacity, which at the end hopefully enables a full market integration. In this period, we either need life extension investments or the first guidelines on decommissioning. To summarize the roadmap of meshed offshore grid, we show you in this slide, what is the summary about that? As you can see, to reach the target of having a meshed offshore grid by 2050, immediate action is required. And now we need your action. We've prepared a survey for you to choose then also in which parts we are focusing in the Q&A. The first thing is about legal aspects. How do we cooperate? The second is hybrid assets or small zones. The third is how much does it cost? The fourth topic is how to attract investments and how to do cross-border cost allocation. And the fifth, which is called sixth here anyway, is the recommendation and timing for an efficient rollout of the grid. So what Jochen will now do is to start the poll option for you, where you can click on one of the one of the options, and we'll start the Q&A session then afterwards with the most preferred section.
Does everybody see the poll open right now?
I don't see it, but I think we cannot vote. So
yes, you're not allowed to vote, unfortunately. Yeah, but we're getting the first results in. Yeah, it's a close race. Let's give it a little bit more time until everybody has made their vote. We're up to 60% now. All right, yeah, still coming in, still coming in. We already have, it seems, a winner, but let's see what the few last votes will, where that will get us. All right. I think that is it, and we have a winner. And this is the result of our little poll. So it seems people would be most eager to have or talk some further about the hybrid assets or small bidding zones. So I would suggest we continue in that field.
yeah, Lawrence, that would be your topic, and it's the topic of Cecile, who's unfortunately not present today because of her parental leave. So we'll all try, when it comes to legal questions, to replace her here. But maybe we start with the first question there.
Lawrence, I'm making you presenter and take away the poll. All right, Lawrence, you would be good to go to share your screen.
Okay, but what is the first question? I'm still not.
So I think the first question for you, Lawrence, is if overplanting of wind parks is not allowed, then the problem of low or zero price at times when there is much wind does not exist, right?
Yeah, that is correct. However, then you also have a more expensive offshore wind system than necessary. So my idea is that you should the top priority should be system cost minimization, and then the governance should follow that, should accommodate, let's say, the techno-economic optimum. I'm not seeing the questions. I'm not quite sure how this works. So
yes, Mark, would you actually like to maybe share your screen again with the questions we received up front?
Yeah, I can not at the moment.
I just made you presenter again, so you should be able to share.
That could be the problem. Yeah, the second one is this one. It doesn't work, Jochen, so I am going to read it with.
Yeah.
What is maybe it's what is the benefit of the proposed put option over financial transmission rights?
The benefit is only in the legal area, in the idea. Well, the financial transmission, economically they work the same. They have the same effects. Our assessment was that financial transmission rights are in conflict with the EU rule that TSOs are not allowed to return congestion rents to generators, because that's what a financial transmission right does. So in order to avoid the money loop where the TSO collects congestion rents and returns them to the generators, The put option basically gives the generator the revenue that he would have had if he had received the nodal price or zonal price plus the financial transmission right. With the put option, he gets that right away, and the money doesn't flow via the TSO. So it's a little bit of an artifact to deal with this rule.
Okay. I think John, you also had a question. Can you unmute yourself and then you could ask the question?
I don't have the question in front of me anymore, but I think the question that I had from the point of view of how possible is it to bring the assets and not have it based on congestion revenue, but based on regulatory, bring the assets into the regulatory environment.
Sorry, wasn't that actually one for Cecile or for me?
I think it's probably better for a better question for Cecile, but the idea that we had was that once you start building the grid out and it becomes more ubiquitous, the congestion revenue will be insufficient to finance the grid elements you might need, and you may want to consider bringing for security reasons, bringing the assets into the regulated sphere instead of being financed by congestion revenue.
Oh, absolutely. There's actually congestion revenues are a really poor source of financing for grids. One, because they're unpredictable, and two, because the congestion rents are maximized at a level of grid investment that's way below the social optimum. So they would give the TSO a wrong incentive, or in other words, the TSO would get punished for making an optimal investment by getting very low congestion rents. So for these reasons, also in the EU, it's not allowed to provide congestion rents directly to grid operators. Typically, they're siphoned off, they're put in a separate fund, and then under regulatory supervision, they're used for infrastructure investments or something like that. So in the proposal that we made, we also minimize congestion rents with the idea it's better to maximize wind park revenues and thereby, again, to minimize the need for financial support or to phase financial support out as soon as possible.
Now, it's one interesting topic is also the topic of subsidy schemes. I know that you didn't directly analyze that because it's another topic which then needs to come. But what would be, from your point of view, the optimal way to tackle that, to analyze that, and to, yeah, you know, every country has different support schemes, and for the wind park operators, it will create a certain uncertainty if there is an offshore grid where they are connected with different support schemes. So how would you tackle that from a methodology point of view?
Well, looking at who's paying and who's benefiting, I think the big challenge of an offshore grid is that if you as a national government create a support scheme, you actually don't know where your support money is going because you don't know where the energy will go. If you have a meshed offshore grid, the power can flow in any direction. Now, of course, you could say you could have a joint support scheme where you pay on a pro rata basis, so everybody pays for the share of power that flows to their country. That would already make it a bit easier, except that there's some budgetary risk because you only find out ex post how much of the generated power has flowed to your country. And then there's a further complication for the countries on the continental side, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, that the power that they import from the offshore grid may not stay in their countries, but may be moved on further into Europe. And the only way to really fix that, I think, would be kind of an updated version of guarantees of origin, where but I think politically that's quite difficult. But basically, where the support schemes of all countries, or the support money of all countries, would be tied to the origins of the power that they consume. But that would be difficult, or one pan-European support scheme. But in the absence of those continental solutions, it's always going to be a little bit messy. But that's also the case now, of course. So the Netherlands imports a lot of green energy from Germany at a very low price. We're not complaining about that.
You're not probably, but yeah, we maybe. Is there another question we have on the?
These exist already, but they're going to get worse when you have a huge concentration of power generation offshore that actually is needed to be moved into the continent because it's one of the main sources of renewable energy.
Do we have other questions? Jochen, I see we didn't receive further questions.
From the audience, 1 second, I forward that to you.
Oh, maybe Jochen, you could just read it.
Oh, we'll do it this way, exactly. So the question that has been posed by one of the members of our audience right now is, couldn't an EU-wide and maybe UK-wide CFD type of support mechanism be the best instrument to maximize offshore wind farm investments, connecting it with the MOG concept?
Yeah, I think generally if you arrange it at the whole system level, EU plus GB would be great. It's still not, the contract for differences are great for wind park developers, but it's not said who is paying how much into which countries pay how much. So that will also be a tricky issue. Who's going to contribute too much to the support scheme?
I think Pratt also had a comment on that question.
Yes, I have a short comment here. Maybe I'll put on my screen as well. That is that the clean energy package, and before even the third package itself, also supported joint mechanisms, although they were not used much till now. So joint support schemes could be one way of going forward, although it needs to cost-benefit analysis of that needs to be done. How, to what extent these joint support schemes can be used. So that's one way of doing it. But in general, we also see like a convergence towards a certain contract for differences sort of a mechanism, or feed-in premium sort of a mechanism that's happening across Europe in terms of how renewable support schemes are functioning. So I think these are, I just wanted to chip in with these 2 points that yes, there is a bit of an encouragement and push towards these joint support schemes, which would see a greater harmonization of renewable support across the continent. Brexit, you said a UK-wide and a EU-wide. Yes, we need to really keep that in mind, that now we are going to have UK, which probably would be identified as a third country outside the EU. And then how do you harmonize that, especially when it comes to the meshed offshore grids, and with a huge part of the North Sea being the UK as well. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on this one.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Jochen, I didn't see some.
No, right now that was the only one from the audience we got during this live session now, but I still think we had some coming in before that, right?
Yeah. Lawrence, it's your topic about the small bidding zones. I mean, you developed that. Is there something you want to share with everybody? I mean, it went into the deployment plan. We said that we have to go for both solutions, hybrid assets and small bidding zones, and to stimulate both, because both takes time. Is there something you want to share with the audience about this concept, in addition to what I just said as a summary?
I think it's really important. For some people, it comes across as a little complicated. It really isn't. It's basically the idea of zonal pricing that we have in Europe, except that we make the offshore zone smaller, so that there's no congestion within a zone ever. Then if you do that, then the whole governance, the whole pricing system becomes pretty simple and transparent. Your cross-border flows are maximized, your dispatch is optimized. And what's really important is if you set the incentives right this way, you can allow the decision about overplanting to be made by the wind park developers. So the TSOs develop a grid, they plan the connection points. A developer buys the right to feed in a certain amount of power at a certain node, but he can also overplant. That means that he can produce more during low wind hours. And that's, of course, when the price is higher, when we really need it. He can also produce more if someone else has a technical failure or if some of his own wind turbines are in maintenance, then he can use as others. So it really makes the system a lot more efficient. It's a little bit of a step out from how we're thinking now. The default is that we just each develop our own section of the North Sea, put our own market price there, but that really leads to the market results not reflecting the physical reality of the offshore grid. And it's really important that the market, the prices, reflects the actual value at the moment, at every moment.
Yeah.
So I think there are really strong advantages to that model of having small price zones.
Yeah. There could be countries hesitating to go for such a solution because they know their national schemes. Could you quickly summarize how also for the wind park developers you take the fear of that something goes wrong and that the investment will not be reimbursed by the market, that you will end up in zero prices or things like that? Can you quickly summarize that? I mean, we touched on that already, but so for the wind park, how to take away their fear?
Okay, well, one is, I think for now, support schemes are still needed, like contracts for differences. If they're not needed, they'll phase themselves out. People will bid less and less, will request less and less support. And the other is either the put options or the financial transmission rights. They give you the right to an onshore price to the extent that there's network capacity available. And because these onshore prices are much more stable than the offshore zonal prices, that provides a strong price hedge. So also if you have merchant investment without financial support, with these FTRs or put options, the wind park basically gets the revenues as if he's physically located in that onshore price zone to the extent that there's network capacity available. And then he can build more generation capacity, he can overplant and use that during low wind conditions, for instance.
Yeah.
So basically the short answer is the put options or FTRs, they provide a price hedge and then probably financial support in the form of contracts for differences. They finish it off and give a certain and a low risk revenue stream.
Jochen, did we receive more questions on that? If yes, you could just say it.
Yes, we indeed get another question in, posed by Daniel from the audience, and he asks, you say that offshore bidding zones would increase the revenues of wind farm developers, but wouldn't it be that the perceived price is regularly low because its marginal cost is close to zero? And what about managing the imbalances?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. The marginal cost is indeed close to zero. However, it is the marginal value typically that sets the price. So if you have a wind park here and let's say 1,000 megawatts and 500 goes to country A, 500 goes to country B, the marginal value of producing one megawatt hour in that park is the value at which you can sell it onshore if there's no congestion. So if there's no congestion, the park price becomes the onshore price. Now, if it's connected to two onshore zones, one has a price of 40, one has a price of 50. Of course, you send as much as possible to the 50 euro per megawatt hour zone. So, and the remainder goes to the 40. So the marginal value is then 40. So the park price becomes 40. prices of zero only exist during high wind conditions and with overplanting, when basically you need to curtail wind in that node. Then the marginal value is zero because you cannot sell it anywhere. Now, to protect that, to protect from the wind park revenues collapsing during high wind scenarios, we advocate either financial transmission rights or put options, where the volume that can be transported to the shore is remunerated at the onshore prices, and only the curtailed volume has a value of zero. By the way, that has the advantage that no one has to pay compensation for curtailment. It becomes a decision by the park operator. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. I hope that answered the question.
Yep, I've just asked Daniel if he has any more comments or questions or any follow-ups, basically. If he doesn't have, we have one more question. Let's give him a second maybe to post a reply, or quickly just raise your hand if you have a follow-up question, Daniel. All right, yeah, hand goes up. So we wait a second until he can phrase his question. All right, here we go. So the follow-up to the question would be, to quote you, as long as there are no congestions, good. But can we ensure from wind developer side that there will be no congestions? Again, quote, as long as there are no congestions, good. Ah, no, okay, that's a double up, sorry. So that's basically the question. Can we ensure from wind developer side that there will be no congestions?
Well, from my perspective, that should not be ensured. I think with a good, well, see, the techno-economic optimum is that there's overplanting, and that means there's congestion sometimes. That's when the whole system is at its lowest cost. And with the right market design, the wind developer himself decides how much to overplant, and it's rational to overplant. Why? Because then you can produce more when there are turbines in maintenance and during low wind hours. Now, I'll give you a really simple example, and I'm wondering, can I share my screen for this purpose?
1 second, I give you the presenter rights. Yeah, you should be good to go.
And then what do you see actually? Do you see my screen now?
Yeah,
yes,
it says put up simple example.
Yeah, okay, very good. So let's say you have this wind park. It can produce 1,200 megawatts, but you only have a 1,000 megawatt connection to the shore. Very, very simply said. If it's only one park, of course, you could just curtail, and then there's not really a market price. But let's say this is an offshore hub with 4 or 5 parks, and they're all competing, and they have overcapacity at that moment. There was overplanting. Now, what you do is you can allocate 1,000 megawatts worth of either transmission rights or put options to this park. Basically meaning that the park operators can sell 1,000 megawatts at the onshore price of 30, and only the remaining 200 megawatts gets a price of 0. And because they're 0, the park operator won't mind curtailing them. Now, this is maybe a bit of a crude example with 20% overplanting. The key is the park operator gets a connection right of 1,000 megawatts, and it gets the right to sell 1,000 megawatts at the onshore price. And then he can decide by how much to overplant. Now, why would he overplant? On the one hand, it means sometimes he needs to curtail, but you shouldn't forget that curtailment happens when everybody's producing a lot of wind and the wholesale market price is low. At other moments, these extra turbines will be able to generate more wind, more revenue, like when the wind conditions are less favorable, but there's still some wind. At these times, the onshore price is likely to be much higher. And the whole idea of this market design is that the park developer himself can make this calculation, can make this optimization and decide by how much to overplant. He does this efficiently because he gets exactly the social value, the market value of the wind that he produces, and none of it sticks with a TSO in the form of congestion rate. So I hope that answers the question. We can unshare the screen, by the way. Do I need to do that?
Yeah, I think you should do that, but Jochen can take it away as well.
Yeah, you should.
If there are no further questions, I would propose that we jump to the next topic. So Jochen, what was the second popular topic? Was it how much does it cost, or?
So the second most popular topic were actually the legal aspects and how do we cooperate. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think that would be a topic for Hannah. And there she is.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hannah. Jochen, did we receive the question? So I think that one I saw that it's besides the North Sea Agreement, what other legislative changes are necessary to enable meshed grids?
Yeah, so I should say that I'm sort of answering these questions kind of on behalf of Cecile, who, as Mark mentioned, is away. So a lot of what I'm reflecting in these answers is based on the work that she's been doing over a number of years. So don't want to take any credit for it. But one of the things that Cecile looked at alongside the kind of larger kind of overall overarching governance framework was what are the kind of legal and regulatory changes might be needed to smooth the process of deploying additional offshore wind. And one of those things was looking at kind of planning and permitting rules and also decommissioning rules. So at the moment, projects might be within a single jurisdiction, both the offshore wind park and the connection to shore. And while that's still often quite a complex planning process, at least you're only working with one government on one set of rules. As we move to a meshed offshore grid, you're looking at developing more multi-jurisdiction projects, and the complexity of that planning process increases as you're having to work across multiple planning departments, looking at kind of different rules across different jurisdictions. And that kind of presents a risk rather that you have a significant delay on your project timelines, and that jeopardizes our potential of delivering the level of offshore wind that we think we need to meet our net zero targets in 2050. So Cecile looked at this and looked at ways of aligning rules across different countries, and what she didn't advocate for was having kind of complete alignment of planning and permitting rules across countries. I think there is benefit in having some difference. You can learn from best practice across different organisations, but what she did feel was beneficial was that where you have a multi-jurisdiction project, you set up kind of a one-stop shop that brings together the relevant planning departments from the jurisdictions involved, and that's then a single point of contact with the developer of that project, and it streamlines that process to try and minimise any delays or any inconsistencies in approaches. Similarly, kind of when it comes to decommissioning, at the moment there's different rules and kind of recommendations as to how both the offshore wind park itself and the transmission assets are decommissioned. Are they, is a certain part of it left in situ, or does it all have to be removed? And Cecile's recommendation was there that you take a kind of international approach and develop some best practice guidelines that can be applied to the whole North Sea region, taking account of any kind of localized environmental impacts that you might need to consider, but hopefully kind of avoiding the situation where you have a long interconnector between two countries, where when it comes to decommissioning that, you have one half remaining in situ and one half needing to be removed, to give an extreme example. So that was kind of one area that she felt additional kind of legislative change would be necessary in addition to that overarching framework.
Thank you, Hannah. I didn't recognize that you are no lawyer, so it's. I think there's one other interesting question. It's about Great Britain and it's about Norway, of course, because they are, or the one is a non-used European Union state already, and the other will be one soon, I guess. What type of North Sea agreement would allow that both EU states and non-EU states are able to participate. And yeah.
Yes, this was something that was quite critical during the promotion project. The Brexit process was happening in parallel to that. So Cecile's recommendation kind of takes into account the fact that you need an agreement that allows for both non-EU and EU parties to participate in, and also for the EU itself to sign up as a signatory. So you don't then have issues with kind of inconsistencies between what an EU member state has signed up to and what the EU laws or regulations are stipulating. So the way that can be delivered is through what's called a mixed partial agreement. So that's a type of international law agreement, and it's one that allows both a nation state to sign up to, and also the EU to be a signatory to that as well. So you can have both EU countries, non-EU countries, and the EU as a signatory to that agreement. There are a couple of precedents for those types of agreement, those mixed partial agreements. Those include the Rhine Convention and the Alpine Convention, both of which kind of sought to lay out environmental protections for those different areas. And that North Sea Agreement, as you touched in your presentation, Mark, kind of can give you kind of a common interpretation of the law of the sea, including a kind of common interpretation of offshore hybrid assets to the extent that that's necessary to deliver other aspects of the regulatory framework. And it gives you that kind of overarching governance framework to allow additional detail to then be developed by the regulator or by individual governments.
Thank you. Jochen, looking at you, do we have other questions from the audience?
No, so far there's nothing new coming in apart from the questions we just discussed.
I think there's one more which is quite interesting. How does the legal framework in the whole setup interact with aspects of regulatory and market setup? So yeah, it comes a bit to the discussion we already had, but maybe you can quickly summarize that as well.
Yeah, so I suppose just to provide a kind of high level kind of overview of that. I think what's really critical about having that mixed partial agreement, that kind of international agreement, is that it just provides that framework for everything else to then fall into place. I think there's a lot of recommendations in promotion that come back to the fact that you need that legal and regulatory certainty in order to, for example, get investors confident in what the kind of the risk and reward would be for the investment that they're making, and to make it viable for them to invest that level of money in developing both the offshore wind parks and the transmission assets that go alongside it. And I think it also, as you said, provides that kind of cooperation framework as well to work through issues that crop up, and which will crop up when we're developing these more detailed regulatory frameworks that touch on ownership structures and revenue mechanisms, for example. So yeah, I think it's the enabling piece that allows everything else to happen. I think is the kind of this quick answer.
Thank you. Any other questions, Jochen, on the legal aspects?
No, I think that is it for now about legal aspects.
Next topic, when I look at the rank, was how much does it cost, wasn't it?
Exactly, that would be the third most popular one. So I think that would be Jelle's part, I would suggest. Yeah. And maybe Alexandra also chipping in.
Yeah, we could do both together so that we have how much does it cost and how do we finance it.
It's fairly related, yes.
Yeah, if you are chipping in, Alexandra and Jelle, that would be fine. So getting the video, perfect.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah, shall we start with the costs? Because that we need to finance. I think one of the questions is, how do you get your costs for the different grid elements?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we conducted a large research, or actually DNVGL, one of our partners did, among stakeholders of the offshore grid, to basically assess the different costs of each of the components that you would use for building an offshore grid. So that will be your converter stations, your cabling, your circuit breakers, and all those different types of components. And essentially we combined into a large model where we basically model the entire offshore grid and then combine those two different elements and try to assess what the costs are. But if you really want to know the full details of how we did this, next week we have a presentation by Yang-Ta Yang from the NVGL on this particular study, where we will go into far more detail on how we did this.
Yeah. It were interesting figures overall, the 170 billion for the offshore grid until 2050. The other thing which would be interesting is the onshore calculation on that. So I know from promotion we didn't do it. However, it's also an interesting sphere, because when it's onshore, then it doesn't automatically mean that it's at the end consumers. And did you make an estimation about additional costs there, or how would you propose to follow up on that?
Yeah, also a very good question. So what we did at the beginning of promotion for this specific piece of research, of course we had to define some boundaries somewhere, and therefore we decided let's not also include the offshore AC, the onshore AC grid, because that would be too large of a model to make. So what we did is for each of the onshore connection points that exist nowadays, we assume that we can upgrade that capacity by a maximum of 4 gigawatts, thereby not impacting the onshore grid too much, and keeping the cost for expanding the onshore grid to a minimum, and thereby we assumed that the onshore grid will be able to take in that significant capacity without too many additional costs. However, you can imagine that there's some onshore connection points nowadays that would be far shorter to a significant number of offshore wind parks, and in that case you would have to assess how you would strengthen your onshore grid in order to accommodate such a large increase of offshore wind feeding into that onshore grid. So that's a whole different study that you would have to conduct. That's why we propose to leave that out in promotion. But yes, it will be definitely very important to also take this into consideration when you actually start building all these different elements.
Thank you. I think there's one last question about it, maybe also from the audience, then more question. The one question is, could you further elaborate on the large reductions in costs for the hub in comparison to the other ones, to the national, the European, and traditional one?
Yes, definitely. Yes, I will also do that next week, but I'll give you a short summary here. So for the hub concept, we have an estimation for the cost of an artificial island. And what we see there is that an artificial island can host significant amounts of offshore grid capacity, so the offshore converters. And the costs are actually quite low for such an artificial island. And what we see in the modeling of the different grid concepts, that there's quite some areas where there's a very high concentration of offshore wind capacity, and especially in those areas, it would be very beneficial to combine this all together onto an artificial island. Thereby, you mitigate the costs for building offshore support structures for the converters, which is now mainly just a platform, and you replace those costs of building a platform by building an island, and that has a huge saving potential. Of course, we also estimated some benefits or costs of replacing platforms with islands. That's something that we won't deal with today. But yeah, there's definitely a pure cost advantage to building an artificial island.
Thank you, Jelle. Jochen, do we have some more questions from the audience?
So far we don't. So
So we'll switch to Alexandra.
Exactly.
Alexandra, about financing.
Exactly.
You looked at financing and if there are sufficient capital, or if there is sufficient capital to facilitate investments in the meshed offshore grid. What's your view on that?
Yeah, first of all, as Jelle mentioned, we are talking about very large, massive investments offshore. So we heard about 170 to 200 billion euros by 2050. So this is a lot of money, and as you mentioned, Mark, it comes on top of the requirements for reinforcements of the onshore grids to prepare for the renewable energies. So what we saw exactly from our interviews within promotion with different types of investors, with transmission system operators, with private investors, there's a lot of interest in the market. But the main barrier is the lack of a legal and adequate legal and regulatory framework for this kind of investments. So I would say in order to finance such a structure, first of all, we need to have a legal, a long-term, stable and predictable legal and regulatory framework. Because the investors need security. They need a long-term visibility on the project pipelines, and they need also clarity on if and how the regulatory framework will change or adjust should the purpose of transmission assets change. And of course, a very important element is that there should be clarity on the responsibilities and liabilities of all the actors that are involved. Especially for topics like the maintenance and operation of the grid, also in case of delays in commissioning of transmission assets or a non-availability of the grid. So within promotion, we suggested to have in the long term an offshore liability regime as part of the overall regulatory regime for a meshed offshore grid. I think this is the first step in order to secure the financing. And then, of course, we need to have financing and I would say economic ownership models that can accommodate different types of investors and financing structures to cover these massive investments. And therefore, we found it prudent to consider different options for ownership models, such as, for example, TSO substructures, and as you mentioned before, were TSO equity partnerships with where the TSOs have the majority of voting rights, while external investors, public or private, could have the majority of economic interest, or other structures like tenders, for example, of transmission assets to third parties, forming special purpose vehicles for individual transmission projects. And also another model was one builder, let's say, of the grid, one entity who builds the grid and then tenders parts of the grid to third parties for ownership and maintenance. This kind of structure, for example, could be seen as a dedicated equity fund for the meshed offshore grid, supported by the national TSOs, by public or private also investors like infrastructure funds or pension funds, and the European Commission. there are also other options combining aspects from all of these models. Definitely, there is experience in the market, and there are many and several funding options also at the debt side, like green bonds or hybrid green bonds. We have seen that TSOs and also transmission owners have used innovative funding. So we are positive that financing itself wouldn't be a problem as long as a stable and predictable regulatory framework is in place.
Thank you. I think you answered a couple of questions, so that was really a good wrap up again of the whole complex. Maybe to summarize that, what do you see as the main challenges for investing in a meshed offshore grid and how to overcome them? 3 points.
So as I said, legal framework, or the backbone, as many stakeholders say. What is the backbone in order to play? Clarity on responsibilities and liabilities, because we are talking about a massive structure. There are involved many actors, offshore wind farm developers, transmission system operators, other transmission owners, and there should be clarity on who is liable and responsible for what. So I think these 2 points are very important for investing in a meshed offshore grid.
Thank you. Jochen, do we have any other questions on the financing?
No, I think so far that is it. And if no new questions or any previous questions, if that is it, we can move on to the next topic.
Can I jump in?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, Alexander, how much of the, I mean, we've discussed also, we had discussions with the EU and the investment banks. How much do you think that the EU would be prepared to sort of back or de-risk projects on behalf of on behalf of partners or investors in the grid?
Thanks, John. So I would say I would confirm that we need some EU support, at least at the early stage. And I would say first, maybe some EU support to support financially studies and works for the further progress of forming this backbone. So to deal with issues like regulatory arrangements between the jurisdictions, market arrangements for all the market participants, or ownership issues, and so on. So there should be a lot of work there, and some EU support in that should be essential. And then when the first projects are going to come there, especially for testing new HVDC technologies, new equipment, some EU support will be needed, and we know that there are already programs, R&D and deployment programs, and new are going to be launched soon, the next years. And this would help definitely to accelerate the industry, the technical progress of the industry. And I would say we need also some support in anticipatory investments, because the meshed offshore grid will develop gradually based on individual projects, and in the long term we'll need anticipatory investments to cover the future long-term needs. And these investments usually are quite risky because of the lack of coordinated planning for the region, because of currently not adequate cost allocation mechanisms, and so on. So in the question how much, I'm aware that European Commission proposed to increase this, for example, the CEF funding for energy up to 8.7 billion euros, I think, for the period for 2021 to 2027. Of course, this is not only for the North Sea region, but for also Baltic Sea, for the Mediterranean, for onshore. So one part will be also dedicated to the North Sea. I believe if we have a political commitment from the countries that are connected to the mass offshore grid, and also the support from European Commission would be sufficient to go further with the development of a mass offshore grid. In numbers, how much? I think that depends, of course, on the grid configuration, on specific projects, technologies that will be used, and so on. But it's a good step to see that the European Commission has launched and is going to launch also new programs to support these developments.
Thank you, Alexandra. If there is no further question, John, you have one?
No, it's Brad. I just wanted to quickly chip in to Alexandra this question that John asked, a very interesting question, but I think the European Commission by itself is very much aware and is doing its bit. The Connecting Europe facility, the CEF funding, as Alexandra mentioned, has been increased for the projects of common interest. We can imagine that in the future, the projects of common interest would include some meshed elements as well, because they are across the border, indeed connecting Europe. And the CEF itself just does fund innovative projects, and innovation is one of the key aspects that is covered under this INEA funding. Having said that, about the political commitment, indeed, even during the time of coronavirus and COVID, we see that the European Union and in general has been very supportive towards a sustainable recovery. So looking not just at sustainable growth, but even sustainable recovery, where renewables are not forgotten in the process of recovering from this crisis that we are going through right now. And this can be seen from the new Green Deal that's come up. And as part of the Green Deal, indeed, you will see not just offshore wind, but other innovative decarbonization projects which would be supported in the coming years. So that actually shows a very strong commitment from the new Commission towards renewables, towards a green future, and of course offshore wind, which will make a huge part of it. Also considering the fact that there is also a push for becoming self-reliant in terms of energy, and which means that this offshore wind can also be used for other dimensions which are a bit outside the scope of this study, but like green hydrogen in the future. So commitment exists, funding exists, still needed for offshore grids, but as you see that there are some which in the pre-COVID world, there were some tenders which were also at zero cost, so with zero support as well, which were being built. Some things to point out and remember.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you. Do we have any other question on financing or attracting investors? If not, I
think we can move on.
Yeah, then Brad could just stay in and maybe turn on the video so that we go to the CBCA topic. Thank you, Alexandra. Brad, I think we have one question on the CBCA, which is how can CBCA help with future-proofing offshore grid development?
Okay, time is short, so I will do this in 1 minute, 30 seconds. But I think CBCA is a good tool to future-proof, especially considering the fact that we are going through a big crisis in terms of COVID as well as Brexit, where the UK would become third country, like I mentioned earlier. CBCA can help in future-proofing by doing two things. The first one, which is a key recommendation, is that you put binding commitments in the CBCA on construction deadlines. This would lead to a lesser number of bridges to nowhere being built. By doing that, you're already future-proofing in a way by reducing the risk of stranded investment. So reducing risk is something you can do using a good CBCA. This can also be improved by having a more coordinated and more transparent process of developing the CBCA, as well as the CBA, which the CBCA is based upon. By doing this, again, you're reducing the risk. You're taking into account other projects which are in and around the one that you're creating the CBCA for, and taking into consideration complementarity as well as competition between different projects while you're developing and allocating costs across the board. And the third part, which also should be kept in mind, is that you can depend less and less for support to build this. As far as possible, try to make commercially viable grids. Although in the beginning you might require a bit of support, but that should be the overall long-term goal, to make infrastructure that's commercially viable. So yeah, I think in 2 minutes. So you have 2 more minutes to conclude, Mark.
Thank you. I think I have one more question for you. It's more related to the promotion project. If I look at project like Vizcaya Gulf or in Latvia projects, it's always difficult for, if there is a connection between Spain and France, for Poland, for example, to pay for this and to estimate the benefits upfront, because there are a lot of uncertainties and assumptions which are done, but at the end doesn't need to realize the benefits for this country like Poland. For promotion project, at the beginning there need to be should be a CBCA, which countries benefit, but apart from the coastal states, how to overcome that and how to make the others paying as well for other European states paying as well for the benefits they get.
I think this is a big part, a big discussion about the new TENI revamp, right? How do you do this? Because it's not just an economic question. So there is a political dimension to it, because you see a non-hosting country getting benefits. So I think first step to start off with is to relook at the threshold for becoming part of how much benefit you get, which is like the 10% threshold, which is reduced to 5 in steps right now. So that's one thing that you need to look at and need to be revamped. And the other one is more a consensus sort of a issue, because it's political in the end. So to explain to Poland that how it benefits from a Spain-Italy line is a very difficult sell, but very difficult sell politically. But in an economic context, it becomes straightforward of showing. And that's where I think transparency helps. I think one thing that can be done as a low-hanging fruit would be transparency. That if you have a more transparent process of your calculation of this cost and this benefits, and making it easy for policymakers and regulators to understand, I think that could be one early positive step towards making non-hosting countries realize the potential of paying for something, for a benefit that they might get from a project that's in a completely different part of Europe. And in the end, it's all about solidarity on the continent and in this new world that we are stepping into in 2021.
Yeah, thank you. CBCA can definitely help to convince there with a proven methodology and with,
Indeed.
Do we have other questions on the CBCA received? Jochen, is there anything?
We do, and I'm going to read it. It's a little bit of a longer question, a little bit two-pronged. Let me know if I need to repeat something. But Pratt, to date, CBCA for interconnectors has been calculated on largely simple formula based on the anticipation of joint ownership and income share.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that there may be, for example, flow or price-based dynamic value share in the future? How are you going to allocate costs if the grid elements are regulated assets but do not directly evacuate energy to shore? For example, cables that might provide transport north-south between countries or bidding zones. So the real question is, what happens when the grid gets complex?
Indeed, it's a very interesting question indeed. But I would say that This would go from rather from a CBCA to more of a CBA discussion, and the way you would then first do your cost benefit analysis. Once you do that, and the methodology that would be used for the cost benefit analysis. And when you, of course, as the complexity increases, you see that your accuracy would go down, but you have to find a good fine balance between the complexity and the way you do your without losing the granularity that you require. And this would then be followed into the CBCA, because if you have a more detailed CBA, then the cost can and the benefits can be allocated accordingly in the CBCA. Having said that, as you can see, already there are steps being taken in doing joint, in increasing the complexity of these sort of calculations. If you see the TY-NDP, which is now a joint work between ENSO-G and ENSO-E, so you're already seeing the connection between electricity and gas, which was not done before. So I would say that this complexity would increase, and I think as skill sets also improve and computation powers also improve in the coming years, we will see more complex analysis being done and costs and benefits being spread accordingly.
Brad, Carlos speaking here. Hi, I just would like to integrate what you're saying, stating that in the next generation, of course, when you're looking at this kind of problem, we have to give a completely different valuation of the security supply as we have been doing as so far, because of course we have to imagine that the entire grid is going to become much more dependent from a highly concentrated source of the same nature. And if any of the elements which is bringing this large amount of electricity towards the grid is going to trip, of course, there are going to be suddenly large chunks of the onshore grid who are going to suffer from this loss of generation. Therefore, the security supply assessment must be, in my view, reinforced in the next methodologies. And this is going to translate also in the risk rates that we're going to use in order to remunerate the investments, because of course, these kind of investments are going to become crucial for the electricity supply, the security supply across the entire continent. Therefore, using the proxies, financial proxies, as those we have been seeing in the study used for the onshore network, might become insufficient or shortcoming in order to remunerate sufficiently what are going to be the investments to be done outside. So security supply, to come back to the original point, might be extremely important to be evaluated differently than what has been done so far.
Yes, indeed. I mean, security of supply, I agree with you completely that we might need different parameters, considering that you might have offshore load centers as well in the future, which is not considered in this report as well. I mean, but one more thing that needs to be kept in mind is that we have to see how this new European-wide security of supply assessment supported by national level assessments is going to work, or regional and national level assessments. So that by itself will also give a very different view on security of supply. And I think that would be very helpful, at least at a more system level, and how we consider, that will also help us realize how we consider this meshed grid and the borders that lie in the sea while thinking about security of supply. But indeed, yes, that's a point that we need to consider in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Brad.
Thanks, Carlo. Thanks, Brad. Do we have any other questions on the CBCA? If not, we'll jump to the last topic, I would say, that Jelle and Hannah, recommendations and timing for an efficient rollout of the grid. So if you could jump in with the video, Jelle and Hannah.
Hello.
It was very interesting to see how the things will develop to 2030, 2040, 2050. How did you determine the actions and the timing of the actions? Where did it come from?
Shall I start on that one? So there was a process to go through in terms of understanding how the grid might develop after 2050. So starting with potential total offshore wind deployment by that date. So 3 scenarios were selected, a kind of low, medium and a high level of deployment. And then looking at how different kind of strategies to meshed offshore grid development would connect that generation to shore, to give a kind of a deployment plan from a technical perspective as to how that grid will develop in 5 yearly steps from now to 2050. From there, it was a case of looking at the detail of how that grid develops to understand when we might need the first kind of deployment of particular technical solutions, and from there we can then work backwards to understand what the kind of deployment plan is for that technology in terms of when it would need to be demonstrated, when it would need to be validated, etc., in order for it to meet that timescale. From a legal and regulatory perspective, it's kind of the same process. It's understanding when you kind of see the kind of first elements of meshing and what they look like, and then understanding what particular requirements you would need in place by that point, and working backwards, based on our understanding of how long certain regulatory changes and certain legal changes take to come to fruition, to kind of identify a start date for that process to happen. And then also kind of looking at the order in which things need to happen. So we talked earlier about the overarching legal framework, and that really is kind of a starting point for then a lot of other things to follow on. So it's not that everything stops until that's in place, but it's just being aware that that probably needs to be implemented before you can then finalise the implementation of other aspects of the regulatory framework. I don't know, Yellow, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good good summary of the process of going from the expected grid development to when our recommendations are when do the recommendations need to be ready, and then going back, saying, well, we will probably need at least this amount of time to implement this, so therefore this is when we need to start. Just wanted to mention finally that most of the recommendations come in that beginning of the beginning period, so the 2020, 2030. So essentially now until 2030, based on that specific approach that we took, saying that most of the offshore grid you see still develops kind of similarly as we are used to today. So or that's at least what we expect within promotion, that by 2025 it's more or less similar. Some simple meshed structures are formed, and then by 2030 we see that these mesh structures evolve into something more complex, and that's the point where we need these recommendations in place. So then we start calculating back. So when do we need to start doing something then on that specific recommendation? And that's when we see that it needs to be happening yesterday, essentially, that we need to start then, or at least now, so that we can make that happen within the 10-year period that we have coming up. So very exciting times, I would say.
Yeah, that was an interesting overview indeed, because everything needs to start now, or most of the things need to start now. How do we make sure that it reaches the correct stakeholders who can tackle that? What's your view from the deployment plan view, how to tackle that then after the project?
I mean, I think there's a number of key stakeholders that have been identified in the deployment plan, and it's not just a case of identifying the stakeholder who's kind of got the responsibility for delivering a particular element. It's then understanding all the other stakeholders that will feed into that process, either through consultation or through providing certain expertise to inform some of that decision making. So it really is going to be a kind of joint effort to develop and deliver some of the recommendations in the report. I think what's been key during this project is making sure that we've had continued stakeholder engagement throughout, so that people aren't just coming to the promotion project now at the end and not knowing what we've been doing for the last 4.5 years. It has been a continual process of kind of testing our thinking and our recommendations with key stakeholders like the North Seas Energy Corporation, like the EU, like national governments and regulators, so that people kind of know what we're doing, are on board with it, and kind of have an idea of how to take this forward afterwards, rather than coming to it brand new now.
Yeah, that was indeed the case. There was a lot of stakeholder interaction with within the project, a lot of presentations, recommendations, papers, and I think it also reached the correct stakeholders. So it's up to them to take that up. I saw one more question. Do you need to strengthen European institutions? What's your view on that?
That's quite a difficult one to answer. I mean, I think to give a particular example, on the kind of regulatory side, one of the there were several options that were looked at in terms of how do you regulate a kind of a mesh network that sits across multiple jurisdictions. And there was we did look at would it be the case that you would need to set up an entirely new organisation with those powers to regulate across the North Sea. And actually, in that case, it was felt that that new organisation, the process and the time that it would take to set that up actually isn't the optimal way to do things. It's around not necessarily strengthening individual organisations or setting up new organisations with a specific remit, but increasing the cooperation between existing organisations, and in some cases giving them the powers to work cross border. In the case of regulators. But it's a case of kind of understanding what kind of cooperation is needed and enabling that cooperation. I think I suppose you could say that is strengthening, but I don't think it's a case that we need kind of a whole suite of brand new organisations to deliver this. I think there's capability within what the organisations that already exist. I don't know, Yella, if you wanted to.
Yeah, and I was thinking along the same lines. I'm not entirely sure that you would need to, because if you say strengthen European institutions, it also sounds to me a little bit like you take away responsibilities from national institutions and shift them to a European institution. And then indeed, Hannah, I think I agree with that you would probably need to intensify the cooperation between the national institutions rather than shift responsibilities from one to another. I think the European institutions that come to mind for me are ones is NSOE and ACER. I think their responsibilities and their power, so to say, within Europe is already large enough for them to significantly implement some of the recommendations that we give in promotion in order to make the deployment happen.
Okay, thank you. I know it's Friday afternoon, but do you have any other questions? Are there any things, Jochen, we have in the chat?
There was one more question, but I think that might have already been answered by basically the last answer. And it was basically about what you guys think, who's going to be most suitable to lead the process. And you already alluded to NSOE, supranational national organizations, governments, European Commission. We already touched up upon that. But do you have would you have a preference in that respect? Who would lead the process?
I think, I suppose, coming back to the last answer, I don't think it's a case of having a single leader for all aspects. I think there's perhaps a need for, as the kind of mixed partial agreement and the governance structure suggests, a way of having a kind of a conference, annual conference, to bring together all the leaders of different aspects to ensure that everyone is kind of progressing towards the same goal. So yeah, I don't think it's a case of having an individual leader. I think if this was a solely kind of EU based project, then an EU entity would be the natural kind of lead or oversight of that process. But we're talking about including countries that sit outside the EU. So I think it's a case of establishing a governance process that brings together both EU entities, national governments, both within and outside the EU, to set up that governance framework to deliver the kind of meshed offshore grid.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
I think we have one more question. John, if you could jump on the panel as well here. I think the one question we have is, what about planning wind? What's the conclusion there about planning wind? John, if you could elaborate on that.
What I've been, what I see is that there is there's a sort of a definite need, and one of the things that we'll probably discuss next week is in terms of future planning is one of the major discussion points where cooperation is required, and especially if we talk about things like the hub concept that we've come on to. If you talk about sort of larger structures, the planning of wind is absolutely essential going forwards, and thinking about that a long time in advance, because to build something takes about 10 years. So how do we get from the situation today where each government is planning, we'll build some wind parks here, we'll build some wind parks there, to a situation where if you have a hub structure, there's going to be wind parks required probably in 2 or 3 countries to be able to feed into one platform. So that kind of cooperation in terms of, can involve many organizations and many people, and sort of that's one of the, I think that's been one of the sticking points, because it's a dilemma between wind farm developers who in some places given the freedom to decide to build in certain areas, to more directed by the government. How are you going to coordinate that to ensure that wind is built in the right place?
Thank you, John.
Sorry if it's a nasty question.
No, but thanks. I mean, it's important. You cannot only build a grid, but you also have to plan wind. Otherwise, the grid is useless. It's absolutely clear.
Sorry, I'll go just.
Yeah, what I would like to do now, if there are no more questions on how we plan the grid, I would like to ask everybody to join with the video again. And then we have one last survey after the Q&A where which we want to address to you. It's about what is the most pressing topic to address with regard of realizing a meshed off-grid? Is it the governance question, meaning a political commitment? Is it the regulation? Is it a market setup? Is it the grid ownership? Should it be one TSO stake, or third-party investors? Or is it the financing which we need to solve? So I would be happy to see how the reactions are from the audience.
We're getting the results in.
Yeah, we still cannot click, Jochen. Yeah, that's a pity.
You would be biased. That would not be fair.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, give it a little bit longer. Not everybody has voted so far.
Yeah, please vote. It's
All right, still votes coming in. Okay, I think that is as much as we get, so I will share the results with you. And we have a clear winner.
it's regulation and coordination of grid planning.
Oh.
Personally, I thought it would be governance, because we put it on top, and we also think it's important. But nice to see.
So you try to bias.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. That's fine. So
nasty.
Nice result. Okay. Yeah, then it's maybe we can bring again all the people here. I have some advertisement because what I would like to mention is that we have next week the last breakout session on meshed offshore grid planning, which is also very interesting, starting next week on Monday, and then we have the live Q&A next Friday with the chair of John then, Friday from 10 to noon. And on the 21st of September, of course, we have the final conference, big program, 5 hours, with live panel discussion, with some keynote speakers, and also the conclusions of those breakout sessions. So we would be happy to see you all here. Yeah, I think that's it with our breakout session. I want to thank everybody in the audience. But also especially thanks to the panelists here who answered the question, and also a special thanks to Jochen who prepared that, and Santino who prepared the session. That was quite a lot of work during the whole project, and thank you everybody for doing that, for joining today, and for the interesting discussion.